Have you ever found something in the woods that you didn't know, like a track or some scat? Maybe it was a plant you wanted to know the name of, a bird call you didn't recognize. Imagine if you could ask naturalists all these questions. Well, you can. Check out the Harris Center for Conservation Education's Ask a Naturalist Happy Hour, where all your natural history mysteries will be answered.
My friends Eric and Phil, and see if you can weigh in. And I'll share why I don't think it's scat from a mammal. I think it's something from a bird. So Eric or Phil, would you like to respond to this?
Sure. How do you want to do this, Phil? Do you want to tag team? Because I think there's a bunch of bird questions, and I don't want to answer all of them.
Sure. You take this one initially.
Okay. So, actually, it just shows we can all make mistakes, because when I was running through this earlier, I glossed over this, and I thought, oh, there's a Susie question, and I didn't pay it a second look. And now Susie has correctly called me and on this, and I was incorrect. So Susie can maybe chime in on what makes it not scat, because I am not the prince of scat. But what immediately stands out to me that makes it likely a pellet, and a pellet is a undigested remains of a meal that is, rather than defecated out of the rear end, so to speak, is regurgitated and through the esophagus and up through the mouth of the animal. And so gulls will do this, owls will do this, various species of animals will do this, but in this area, raptors would be the most likely answer. And so that's a really small pellet. The reason I say pellet is because I'm seeing remnants of fur. It's very dry. The consistency of pellets relative to scat is really quite different. There's less cement, for want of a better word, holding all of the constituent ingredients together. So it's very dry. So you get a lot of bones, a lot of fur. And that's what I can see in this. It's a very small pellet. So I'm curious which Jim, and if Jim is on the call, where this came from, because it's really quite small, comparing it to the size of the thumb. Does anyone know?
Well, alongside a trail that we walk every day in Fitzwilliam, about 50 feet above a large beaver meadow, and we assumed that it was barred owl.
Yeah, it's small, but I mean, barred owl is by far the most common owl, in this region. I mean, the options are barred owl, great horned owl, saw-whet owl would be the three most likely in decreasing order of abundance. It's too small for a great horned, and it's probably too big for a saw-whet. So yeah, I guess barred owl. It's hard to make any distinction other than I can see hair particulate matter. I can't really see any bone. I guess I can't see bone remains. Yeah, on the left-hand slide in the middle of the casting, there are bone fragments, and the cursor is over fur at the other end.
See, I think it's cool when you find a pellet as opposed to scat. And what I typically have noticed with pellets is just what Eric was saying, kind of the dryness of it. They're really compacted, and they're tight, and they're in these small pellet shapes, kind of like an almond, where they're tapered at both ends, and they're distinctly separate. So it's not like there was a mammal that squeezed out a little load here and then walked and squeezed out a little load later. They're distinctly separate. And that's how I typically tell a pellet from scat. I always think of owl pellets kind of like, they remind me of dryer lint. They're kind of like fuzz that's kind of pushed together and really kind of tight, and I've often find them in that grayish color. And I'm just curious about the size too, because it strikes me as small. Is it too big for a saw-whet?
I would say probably a little big for a saw-whet.
I would concur. Yeah, I would concur. It looks, I mean, saw-whets are tiny.
Cool. Yeah. All right. So not really scat, more like a pellet. And Eric, you referred to lots of species, but my understanding is that it's primarily bird species, not mammals.
Yeah, that's what I Early birds, yeah.
Yeah, the only other animal or the only mammal that I know of that might occasionally spit up something that's pellety is your house cat from when it's coughing up a hairball, but it doesn't look like this typically. All right, let's see what's next. What do we got? Ah, this is a true scat. This is not a pellet. It says scat on my deck. This was up against the wall. My deck is 5 feet wide. This is quite the load, as I might say. And you can kind of see that it's kind of uniform in shape, and there's no twisting to it really, or tapering at the ends. So like a tapering at the ends where it sort of got some fur coming out the ends, or tapering is typically canine. You'll see that in a canine, and it will be twistier. And if it was something like a bobcat, it would be more like what we call pugs or segmented. So this puts it to me to either be one of our mammals that leaves these kind of uniform scats. So I should mention that my deck is up 20 feet. Well, then that really helps me. Thanks, Karen. That was a good tip. The two mammals that come to my mind are raccoon and opossum. They leave the scat that looks most commonly like this. And with the height that she's talking about, I'm going to put my money on the raccoon as opposed to the opossum, because the raccoon is more of a climber, although opossums do climb. So I would say it's hard for me to look at the content. It's pretty big. I guess I'm still sticking to raccoon as opposed to opossum. Is there anybody out there? Oh, definitely have had raccoons on my deck. Aha, good. I win the Gold Scat Award this time. Thank you. Well, you can never be completely 100% sure. Oh yeah, Brett's mentioning you shouldn't sniff raccoon scat and you shouldn't break it open. A lot of times people out in the field, if they find scat, they'll take 2 sticks and kind of tear it apart. I would not recommend doing that to any scat. And part of the reason why is that scat can contain parasites that become airborne. And if you inhale them, they end up in your brain, which is not a good thing. So you probably, if you find scat and you're interested in identifying it, you can collect it using a plastic bag. Put your hand, just like you're picking up a dog poop, you put your hand in the plastic bag, you pull the scat up. Then when you get it home, you're going to put it in some newspaper, pour it out into the newspaper, fold up the newspaper, leave the newspaper to dry. I kind of tape it closed and I put it up someplace high. I leave it for a week or 2. Sometimes I forget about it. And then when I open it, the scat's dried and you can stick it in a jar and join me in having a scat collection. So that's what I've got. All right, let's move on from scat. The Princess of Pooh is signed in. Oh, this is such a beautiful photograph. This is an interesting question. I'm really curious what Phil and Eric have to say. It says, how do birds produce different colored feathers? Does diet have anything to do with it? What do you say, guys? Phil, what's your thought? Eric, what's your thought?
Yeah. Sometimes diet does have something to do with feather color and pigmentation. With blue, though, blue, I believe, is not necessarily the true color. Yes, like flamingos, Miles. Flamingos and other birds that eat shrimp appear pinkish. Waxwings will take on a certain hue to their wing if they eat a certain amount of invasive plants. They have more reddish or orangish tail feathers, I believe. Buntings, I believe it's the way light refracts through blue, that these birds are actually black. I can't explain the science of it as well, but I believe it's structural rather than diet in this case.
Okay, wait, Phil, are you saying it's kind of like a mirage? They're not actually blue?
That's what I've read. That's what I've read. But I believe that's the case with all birds that have the bluish.
Wow. Oh, yeah. Wow. Eric, do you want to add anything to that?
Eric can add.
Yeah, Phil's absolutely correct. So the blue, we can commonly come across, fortunately, because blue jays are so common, you can commonly find blue jay feathers, especially in the molting season. You can find a blue feather on the ground. And there aren't many bluish birds around, and so If you find a blue feather, there's a good chance it's a blue jay. And so if you hold it up to the light, it turns black. And the reason it does that is because, or turns dark brown. And the reason it does that is because the feather has melanin. So there are three basic compounds in a feather, three basic pigment compounds. So feather color can come from structural properties like Phil was just discussing, or it can come from pigment. There are various types of pigment. And so if you pick up a blue jay feather and you look at it the way you would normally look at a feather, and you're seeing the light be refracted by the feather, by the structure of the feather, and you're only seeing the blue spectrum refracted back at you, and so it looks blue. It's not a case of a pigment absorbing constituent elements of the spectrum. It's a refraction process. If you then take the feather and if you look up at the sky, because you're not seeing the refracted light back to you, you're seeing light coming through the feather, you're not actually seeing the blue, and you're just seeing you're basically seeing the color of the feather based on the pigmentation. And so blue jay feathers and indigo bunting feathers do have melanin in them, and melanins are generally dull browns to dull reds. So that's what you're seeing. So it's pretty cool. Yeah, so all blue birds, all bluish birds. There are a couple of greenish birds that actually have porphyrin pigments in them, but most greens, and certainly all blues, come from those structural properties.
That's great. I have a question for you about orange, like Baltimore Orioles. That's different. That's pigmentation as opposed to refraction.
Yeah, so most yellows and reds come from carotenoids, and carotenoids are produced by plants, and so the animals, birds in this case, generally get the colors from eating plant material or eating something else that's eating the plant material, because the carotenoids themselves are produced by plants, and so they're basically accumulating them, like flamingos that get them from shrimp and krill, or I guess shrimp. And as Phil alluded to with waxwings, they're getting they're accumulating it in their feathers, but they're produced by plants. The carotenoids anyway. And then there are other ones called porphyrins, and they are responsible. They're rarer. They're responsible for the reds and the greens of gallinaceous birds and some African species that we don't have here. But another really cool thing about pigments is, I think this is the coolest. So melanin, so the blacks that you see in that indigo bunting there are produced by melanin, which is it's a pigment. And it's a generally dark brown, black. And it also has this really cool property that it confers durability on a feather. It basically makes the feather more wear resistant. And if you think about birds like seagulls, they have these long gray, whitish wings, and then they have little black tips to the wings. You don't really think about why things are the way they are, but black tips to wings are basically like a patch on your jacket to provide wear resistance.
Wow, I learned something every single time that we have one of these. Last time it was the plucking post, and now it's about the goals, and that is really, really cool. That was a great question. So let's see what our next question might be. Aha! I am very excited to find this at my garden. I know what it is, but I rarely see them. This looks like a question for Jenna, because it's not a scat and it's not a bird. It's not an amphibian or a reptile or a plant. Jenna, what the heck is that thing, and what's it about?
So cool, right? That is a praying mantis egg case, and I have never seen one, except for when I bought one at the store to show students. But you can buy these at garden centers sometimes. So praying mantids, the female will lay this sort of frothy egg mass in the fall, and it will spend the winter in this condition, overwintering. The egg mass will produce a type of antifreeze so that the really cold New Hampshire winter will not kill it. What's interesting about praying mantids is that they are not native to New England. There are two species in New England. There's this species, which is the European praying mantis. The reason I actually don't know how to tell the egg cases apart, but it's geographic. It has to do with distribution. This particular species is the only one that can live this far north. In southern New Hampshire, they have also have the Chinese mantis, They were both introduced around 1900 to the United States. We don't know if it was accidental or on purpose. The Chinese mantis can get larger. So if you're in like Connecticut, you might see a larger one, and that would be the Chinese mantid. These are, there are a lot of myths going around about these, like, oh, they're endangered in New Hampshire. They're not considered endangered because they're an invasive species. So, so if you have these in your garden, it's super cool. I hope you get to see them when they hatch. They're the cutest little things. They look like little folding chairs walking around when they're first hatched. And then very quickly, you will not see them again. I mean, when I've released these before, I bought some at Agway to show some students during one of my classes one summer. And we released them into the garden at Antioch, and we watched them all go. And there were just so many of them, and we never saw them again. And I think that a lot of things prey upon them, and they prey upon a lot of other insects. I mean, they're a carnivore, as insects go. The thing about them, a lot of people think, oh, it's a great thing to release into your garden. I would have to disagree, because they are really not picky about what they eat. So they can eat your butterflies. They can eat your honeybees. Yes, they could eat your pest insects, but they're not going to be picky about what they're feeding upon. So just keep in mind when you see this, it's a really exciting. Praying mantises are an amazing creature. But again, they're not native to our area. And they are, you know, just, they're, you know, they came with Europeans, really, is the answer. So
Jenna, lots of questions. People are curious about why would they sell them at garden centers if they're invasive, and maybe how did the kind of rumor of them being good for your garden get going?
Well, I think it doesn't hurt to sell them at a garden center. It's not like selling an invasive plant species is going to take over the ecosystem. These are really interesting insects. You can learn so much from them by watching them. Really fascinating behaviors. They're not, I wouldn't say that they're an invasive in the sense of being like, they're not going to push out a native species. So it's not going to hurt anything to release them. I would just argue that they're a beneficial, right? Like that they're definitely going to be eating only the pest insects. No, they're not picky. You know, they're going to eat whatever flies by. So,
okay.
Yeah.
Cool. Now, one other question about how many mantid babies are inside that egg case, and when they hatch, are they hatching like miniature praying mantises?
Yes, they are hatching like miniature praying mantises. They're so cute. So I actually don't know how many are in there. I mean, I'm guessing 100 plus. When I had the egg case hatch, they just seemed like they were going everywhere. We had them in one of those net enclosures to watch them for a while, and before we released them, and there were so many of them. So, and then they molt continually until they get to their full grown size if they're not eaten first, because they really are a great snack for another. How big? Is that what you're asking, Susie?
Yeah. Yeah. How big is the adult?
I think the European mantis would be a couple of inches if it gets full size.
Okay.
The Chinese mantis can get like 3 or more, 4 inches.
Cool. If Kathy wanted to kind of keep her eye on this, do you have any idea when their birthday might be?
That's a good question. It's very weather dependent. All of these things are really, they need an accumulation of warm days before they're ready to hatch. And we've had a lot of cool days. I mean, I would just check them every day, Kathy. When I had some that hatched, they were at a garden center. And so I think those were really controlled. They kept them in the fridge. It was June. I took them home, you open the container, and they hatch within a couple of days. I don't know when they normally hatch in New England, but I can certainly find out.
Okay, one last question. This is just me because this is things I think about. I have heard that when the female praying mantis mates, when there's mating involved, what happens to the male?
So about a quarter of the matings will end in a dead male. So it's not all the time. And the thinking is that when she starts to feed upon him during mating, he actually will, this is going to sound interesting, but he will actually increase the rate at which he sort of delivers the spermatophore. So it'll almost like increase his urgency, so to speak. And so that maybe why that developed, because if they're, you know, you have a predator coming, you got to get this done so she can lay, you know, get fertilized. But it's not every single time.
Wow.
Yeah.
All right. We could have a whole show clearly on praying mantises, perhaps. Or, wow. Thanks so much, Jenna.
I have to give you guys very quickly, the scientific name of the European mantis is Mantis religiosa.
Ooh.
It's a good one.
Yeah, that is good. Thanks. That was really interesting. Let's see what we've got next. Aha. This is a reoccurring question at almost all of our Ask a Naturalists. So this is just interesting because I think people are shocked by the answer to this. It says, this is on the Hiroshi land. It is really all woodpecker action? Long shreds. Thank you. So the Lita wants to know, is this really just from a woodpecker or is there something else at play? So first let's talk to the bird pros. Bird pros, what do you guys say?
I would guess there is something else at play in this photo. With long shreds, I can't really get an idea of how long those shreds are, but maybe 5 inches. I mean, it certainly looks like a pileated woodpecker tree. It has those long oval or rectangular cavities that have been hollowed out, but maybe there's a hungry mammal that's going in there too.
Could be. Eric, what do you think?
Like those shreds are longer than a pileated would leave. The little chips that a pileated leaves usually is, you know, an inch or 2 in length.
Yeah, I agree with Phil. I have no idea what the other animal would be. I mean, I can guess, but certainly pileated, and you can see some of the smaller crevices are really only accessible by a sharp chisel, which is what a pileated bill is. So pileated and then something else after. Do you want to comment on what that might be?
Sure, I'll take that one. So I looked at this. This is very exciting, and I actually went to Hiroshi. We got some of these slides the other day, and I happened to have been at Hiroshi, and I was searching for this tree, and I think it was a bear. And the reason I think it was a bear is bears eat a huge amount of insects. They eat, their primary food is insects. They're just getting active after having been in kind of a semi-resting state, and they're very hungry, and they're out and about, and they'll shred up lots of logs and trees in search of insects. They also have a really long tongue. So sometimes they've been documented sticking that long tongue into the holes that have been made by woodpeckers. So when I saw this, I thought this really could be some bear sign. I really wanted to see if there was any other bear markings around the tree, but I couldn't find any. I didn't find any scat, but the chips were really, really long. And I think it was a bear hanging out and trying to eat some of those bugs that the woodpecker didn't get. And it just makes me think about the long tongue of the woodpecker, because I mean, people might be surprised, but a bear's tongue is very, very long and kind of sticky. And woodpeckers have also really long tongues, and they're able to do something pretty unique with their tongues. So I thought maybe Eric or Phil, you might want to talk about their tongues.
Go for it, Eric.
Sure. I mean, woodpeckers have super long, sticky tongues, and they have a pretty unique skull structure, and their tongues actually curl up at the back of their, the back of the bill, the front of the brain, so to speak. They curl up, and they have all sorts of adaptations for an animal that hits its head against a tree. You can imagine if we did that, it wouldn't work out too well. So they have special spongy structure at the front of their skull. But the tongue, yeah, we can't do it. They can. They have a long tongue that they curl up at the base of their bill.
So I've told this to many students that I teach, and the biggest question they want to know is, what do you think your brain tastes like? Right? Their tongue is on their brain. Are they tasting their brain?
Oh, right.
It's a philosophical question, but it's curious. I think there was a question about how much of the bear's diet is made up of insects. And they're quite a bit. I forget the exact percentage. You can check it out on New Hampshire Fish and Game. They have a lot of great information on their website about the black bear. But we think of black bears, a lot of people think of them as eating lots of other mammals. You know, a bear is going to eat a bigger mammal, or they're going to eat fish. But that's not actually true for our black bears here in New England. A huge portion of their diet is made up of invertebrates and also carrion and vegetation. And a smaller part of their diet is made up of live prey. So I don't have the exact numbers, but I'll look into that, and next week I'll be able to, next time we meet, I'll be able to talk about that. All right, let's move on. Let's see what we got. Aha. What role does the decline in insects have on northern U.S. birds? Since the birds are down 30% in numbers since 50 years ago, does this include lack of food or mostly decrease in habitat? This is a complex question. Phil, you want to take a
Sure. Yeah, that's it's a big issue right now. There have been many studies authored by the big conservation groups nationwide: American Bird Conservancy, Cornell Lab of Ornithology, National Audubon, all documenting this trend of declining bird populations. And we know also about the decline of insects that's going on in much of the world. Since our birds around here in the summer mostly eat insects, it does play a big role. I think, you know, it's hard to document just how much insect decline contributes to the lack of birds and the bird decline, but we know that habitat changes, habitat decreases have been a major part of the problem as well. Also more human factors, window collisions, cats, those are all big concerns for bird populations. And yeah, pesticides, I think that is certainly linked to the decline in insects. Maybe Jenna can speak more to that too. But yeah, we have to think that.
There's definitely, pesticides are definitely a really big part in declining insect populations, as is loss of habitat. So that's another piece for the insects. One thing that I just want to mention as a connection here that isn't always just like right in the forefront of our brains is that the pollinating insects are responsible for a lot of the plant species succeeding. And so a lot of the birds that, even if they aren't insectivores, if they're relying on certain plant species, fruits, things like that, that's going to also be a connection related to what food's available for the birds. So you have this multi-layered thing. I mean, I think Phil sort of alluded to it. You've got the habitat loss, and then you have the insect piece, and then of course you layer in that plant piece when pollinators are affected by both pesticides, lack of diverse habitat or wildflowers and things like that. One of the things I will say, that if you are a person that's concerned about all of these things, which I bet most of you are because here you're on this call, one of the things you can really do to help at least the insects, the native insects in the area, is A, not use pesticides in your garden, but B, also plant native plants that these insects have evolved with. So as beautiful as some of the ornamentals are, maybe try and include in your garden area or your planter boxes a lot of native flowering plants and native plants for these insects to feed upon, and then that will have a positive effect on the whole food chain.
That's great, Jenna. I was going to mention that too. And if you're interested in finding out more about native plantings that are good for pollinators, you can visit the Harris Center's website and check out our pollinator garden part of our website. And we have a species list of what species we used in our very successful pollinator garden. And I would just add one other thing to consider, which I like, is consider not mowing as much, or kind of rescaping your front and back landscape to have, you know, grassy, unmowed areas. That's really great. So I recommend that, and let's see what else we've got for another slide. Oh, audio mystery. Heard near a very wet beaver meadow. Okay.
Could you hear that?
I heard it.
Yeah.
Can you play it again, maybe one more time? So I'm curious, because it sounds like something that I'm wondering about, and I'm wondering if this is another bird question. Eric and Phil, does it sound like something you might consider as birdish?
Yes. So I think that's an American bittern, and it has a more of a complex call. Basically, you're just hearing one note there. And bitterns live in marshes, and so they live in an environment where there's a lot of vegetation that's preventing sound from traveling. And birds in those situations often have evolved vocalizations that so low frequency sounds carry better than high frequency sounds. And so birds, you'll find in those situations, often have lower frequency call notes, and that's the case with the bittern. And it has more of a complex call, but there's a very percussive part of the call. So if you're really close to it, you can hear this much more complex call. People variously describe it as chunk-a-lunk. It's a little bit something like that. But if you're distant, you can just hear that one percussive note, and that's where it gets its nickname, a colloquial nickname, the stake driver.
Stake driver.
What? Oh, there's another great nickname called the thunder pumper.
Yeah.
Yep.
That's really cool. So if people were interested in hearing this sound in real life, is there a time of day you would recommend that they go out and listen?
I could tell you when I've heard them recently, right in Hancock. There were a couple of places where they breed not far from the Harris Center. But yeah, find a wet meadow that is adjacent to a large field. It could be a mowed field or just a weedy field. But agricultural areas that have wetland component with cattails. Keene, yes, the Keene, the Dillon Hopkins Airport is a great place to hear them. And you want to go out right around sunset, maybe a little bit later, and again, right before sunrise. So I heard one at 5 in the morning the other day, right next to Hancock Elementary School at the town-owned Kepner Meadow.
Oh, that's great. So look at this, American Bittern. For years, we thought the sound, which resembles a tennis match, was bullfrogs. These pictures are from 2017, as we haven't seen him yet this year. Just heard him. Is it a male? That's the question. Is only the male making that sound?
Yes, only the male is yes. The male. There's a couple of calls. That's the equivalent of its song. They're not songbirds, but that's the equivalent of its song to stake out a territory and attract a female. And they also have a flight call, which is a very hoarse croak. The female, I'm guessing the female makes the flight call, but the song is generally just the male defining a territory and attracting a female. And so you can't really tell them apart. They're slightly bigger than the males are, but otherwise they look pretty much indistinguishable.
When they're calling, are their heads up in that upright position? Is that like a call position, or is that something different? That just seems like an unusual position.
You want to take
that? That's mostly their display position when they're out displaying in open fields for the females. I haven't seen one calling in that position, I guess, personally.
Wow,
You mostly hear them. They're hard to find.
I haven't either. The sound is made by contorting their esophagus, and I think Phil's absolutely right. I don't believe they make this. They have a freeze posture, so if there's a threat, a perceived threat, they will point their bill skywards and freeze and sway with the grasses and hopefully avoid detection. And when they make the noise, they're contorting their esophagus, and I don't believe they do it in that position.
Wow. Again, I learn something new every time. A bird that makes its like romantic call by contorting its esophagus is pretty fascinating. And I like the idea of freezing like that and trying to blend in with the grass. They're hard to see. I've known that you might not, it looks like, of course you would see that, but I've been staring right at a bittern and not seen it until I've heard it. So they're really masters of good camouflage. Any other bittern facts, Phil or Eric, that you want to add before we move on?
Super cool animals. They're one of our coolest birds. That's all I'll say.
That's cool. Way to go. Phil, how about you?
They're a declining bird species in a lot of areas. So, the habitat is a critical item for them, having some fallow areas, such as a farm next to a wetland. It's very important for bitters. So conserve land.
Yeah,
That's
and they will
great.
come up out of the marsh into a meadow, like Phil alluded to, into a fallow meadow in the fall to chase frogs and whatnot, and probably insects too.
Wow, so cool. Well, way to go, bird guys. Love it. All right, let's see what we got. Okay, late winter, we were walking by a beaver pond and saw this. Are they air bubbles made by the beavers swimming underneath? So this falls under my area, which is mammals, and it's not scat. I know maybe people are just assuming that I'm the princess of poop for scat, but I also love tracks. And when I see this, I'm not thinking air bubbles. I am thinking, because beavers, when they're under the water, they're not really breathing or doing much kind of like bubble making. They're just swimming from hole to hole or from air spot to air spot. This to me looks like a melted out track, and probably could have been even a mustelid, or that's an animal in the weasel family, like an otter, kind of bounding from spot to spot. And they'll often use holes that beavers make, and they frequent a lot of beaver areas during the winter time because the beavers do the work for them by keeping open the holes. So coming up out of a beaver hole is something you could see a otter do. And then those are just really melted out. So otters do a bounding pattern typically where their two front feet are landing in their back feet are landing in the same spot that their front feet have been in, and kind of stretching out a little bit like an earthworm or a slinky from space to space. So that's what I think that is. And I saw that Jenna agreed with me, but I really like this. It's a good mystery because when you find a melted out track, it can be hard to figure out what it is, but that's my best shot at it.
This is Trisha who sent it in. It's definitely not.
Couldn't hear you. Trisha, you got cut off. It's definitely not.
It's definitely not otter where what I've seen what you're talking about over in Marlow, but I could see how this is a melted out print, but I can tell you it's not an otter. This is not otter environment.
Well,
so
you might be surprised what otter environment constitutes. I've seen an otter at the wetland behind Hannaford's in Keene. I saw an otter go through my backyard. I live in downtown Hancock. So, you know, we have an idea that otters must live in these really pristine kind of areas. But I'm seeing some people are thinking maybe it's people. Maybe it was a person walking from spot to spot. And Jeremy suggested a kid with a hockey stick. Is that a hockey stick? Is that it? Is that a hockey stick, Mark?
I don't think it was.
I don't think it's hockey. No, it's just water.
It's just water.
Okay, well, thanks for the idea.
Yeah. I mean, it's
kind of
hard.
track. That's
It's
great.
a track, not as opposed to a beaver air bubble, because they don't really make that much bubbles under the water. But
Okay.
yeah, cool. Thanks, Trisha.
Okay, thank you. Thank you.
You're welcome. Okay, let's keep going on. What we got next? Aha, this is really cool. I won't really read the whole thing, but really what happened was a New Hampshire resident, Cameron Fisk, snapped several photos of a banded eagle in Harrisville. And what's really cool, it was near Lake Scatutakee. It was the old 23-year-old male bald eagle, Gold W84. It was banded nesting at Little Quabbin Island in the Quabbin Reservoir in Massachusetts, which is really neat. It was part of the captive breeding program, and you can kind of read about this. And I'm wondering if Eric or Phil want to add anything about this bird in particular, or the eagles in our area in Monadnock region. This one wasn't captive bred. Oh, but its future partner was. Okay, that's good to know. I thought it was, but okay. Eric and Phil, do you want to add anything about the about this eagle in particular, or the eagles in the Monadnock region?
I think that statement says it all about that eagle. I don't know too much more about that particular bird, but I have heard the bird on Lake Nubanusset has been the most, or the nest on Lake Nubanusset in Hancock has been the most productive eagle nest in New Hampshire as far as the number of chicks that have come out of this nest reared to adulthood. So Hancock and the Harris Center lands have a role to play in contributing to that success. There's another nest in the vicinity too, in Powder Mill Pond. There's one at Granite Lake at this point. Surrey Lake. So eagles are spreading through the area.
Hey, I have a question for you about eagles and osprey. Does the increase in eagle nesting in this area decrease the number of osprey nesting in this area?
That's a good question, and it seems like that's what biologists have noted recently, is that ospreys have been driven away from their traditional habitats, nesting habitats on the edges of lakes, major rivers. Eagles have taken over those choice territories, and in some cases taken over the nest themselves. So ospreys are being relegated to the more marginal territories on beaver ponds and power line corridors.
Great. And Eric, is there anything you want to add?
No, pretty much that's it. I would just, if folks are interested in seeing the eagles, Phil mentioned the Powder Mill Pond nest, and if you're driving north on 202, just before you get to Bennington, you'll pass Powder Mill Pond on your right, and if you're, gotta be careful obviously because of traffic, but where the road rises, there's often a fast food truck on the left-hand side of the road just before Bennington. Pull off to the right there and look back down to the south, and you'll see pretty clearly, you'll see the nest in the crown of a white pine, and that's a pretty easy one to see. Then you can also see the newbie one but you've got to get into a canoe for that.
I stopped at that one today, the Powder Mill nest, and there was a young eagle sticking its head out as the adult was next to the nest. So if you pull out right across from the fryer truck, just a little parking spot there, don't stay too long. Take a quick look off to the right on the island, you might see the nest and the baby.
Wow, that's such great news. And one day in the future, maybe we'll all have to meet there for Ask a Naturalist, have some French fries from the fryer truck and do a little eagle watching. That's back when life gets to normal again. Nice job. Okay, let's see what we got.
I have a story about an eagle that my neighbor saw on my property. I live in Marlow on the Schwalet River, and she said there was an otter in March basking on the ice eating fish, which is pretty normal for that time of year. But this eagle was in the tree. It dive bombed the otter to steal the fish, but the otter got away.
Did the eagle get the fish?
No.
The
otter got away with the fish. I should have mentioned that.
Yeah. Wow. Eric, Phil, you want to add anything to that? Or?
That's true. That's a great story.
Love it.
They're opportunistic, and they'll eat carrion, they'll catch live prey, they're opportunistic. So that doesn't surprise me, but you don't often see that. I can say I have seen up to 11 eagles in one place. Just by way of saying, there's so much bad news these days, it's really hard to be optimistic. It's tough. But this is a success story, and I think Phil works for New Hampshire Audubon and the Harris Center, and New Hampshire Audubon deserves a lot of credit for bringing this bird back with Fish and Game. So I've seen up to 11 of these, not in a day, at a single play. I was looking out on the ice this winter, I think it was this winter, maybe last winter, in Hinsdale, and I counted 11 eagles sitting in the ice, and 30 years ago that would have just been unheard of. So it's terrific success story.
A toast to New Hampshire Audubon and the return of the bald eagles. Ha ha, hear, hear, cheers. All right. All right, Miles, we got something else. Okay, let me just, okay, here's some good questions here. What are the yellow flowers here? And are the others ajuga and speedwell? And what animal might have made these near a stream? No noticeable holes nearby. So maybe Brett, you mentioned wildflowers, or anybody? I'm not a flower person.
I don't actually, it's hard for me to see in this picture, and I don't think I know these ones, but I've got a few of my books that I'm gonna poke around in, and maybe someone else knows them and can chime in.
Well, maybe while we're looking at the flowers and other people are kind of thinking about it, I can respond really quickly to the holes. My guess is those are mole holes or mole excavations. So that's made by the hairy-tailed mole. We have two types of moles here in, actually, they could also be the star-nosed mole. We have two types of moles in New Hampshire, the star-nosed mole, which is my favorite, absolute love that animal, and the hairy-tailed mole. And the hairy-tailed mole often leaves this type of digging. So they're basically right under the surface, and they're digging up, and you're seeing kind of raised spots along the way. And you often see this right as spring begins and the snow melts. You go out to your yard, you might notice this. The fact that it's near a stream is intriguing to me because I'm assuming the soil is wet. And the star-nosed mole is more a specialist of wet soils and is even quite a fabulous swimmer and has lots of great adaptations that makes it able to swim. So I can't tell for certain which one it is, but I'm always a big fan when I see mole tunnels like this. I might be the only one who likes to have them on their lawn. Any news on the flowers? Some mullein in the background. I see that too. Yep, that's that silvery kind of lamb's quarter leaf that the pointer's on, and Queen Anne's lace. We're still working on the wildflowers. Let's just go to the next slide and we'll maybe backtrack to that one. Whoa, 14-inch red oak. How long do you think it took the beaver? Is this a joke, Jeremy? Is this like how many beavers does it take to screw in a light bulb? Jeremy, what did you find here? Tell us about red oak. You know a bit about red oak as a tree species. Why would this be hard work for a beaver? Is he still there? He is.
Yeah, this is a picture from Hiroshi where there's tons of beaver activity, especially as you get out toward the peninsula on Dinsmore Pond and then Newmanooset Brook. And I took this picture just because, you know, it's amazing what beavers do, but in this case, here's a 14-inch sound red oak. I guess there's a little bit of potential rot in the center of it, but red oak is one of our hardest, densest hardwoods, and yet, boy, it's really made short work of this. And I'm just wondering, from the animal people's perspectives, how long does it take a beaver to fell a tree this size?
That's, again, sort of like I'm not sure, I don't know. It does sound like a joke, but what I do know is that when you see a beaver taking a tree like that, and an oak in particular, it's running out of its more preferred food. So think of the way when you split a red oak, it has an odor. It's a tannin odor. Jeremy, what is that odor? Is it tannin in there?
Yeah, it's tannins.
Yeah, so it's there's a bitterness to it, and it isn't a preferred food of a beaver. I mean, beavers really like, birches, they love alders, and this is really hard wood. It takes a really long time, probably. I don't know how long. I got it. Next time I see a beaver, I'm going to ask them that. But I would say, Jeremy, would you say that what is the rest of the trees on the edge of that property? Are they running out of their food source?
Yeah, there's not many saplings at all. And so there's some mature oak, there's mature pine, mature hemlock, and then some ground shrub, but no real saplings around. So I think you're exactly right. But,
yeah.
I just can't imagine the amount of work that goes into this. You think about felling this tree with an axe, it would take any of us a couple hours. And well, maybe Phil could do it faster.
You need a sharper axe, Jeremy.
A sharper axe. I mean, it's good to know that beavers, like all rodents, have to gnaw. If they don't gnaw, then their teeth kind of grow in and they'll kill themselves. They'll grow in and ingrown into their neck. I mean, imagine you ever have an ingrown toenail or a fingernail? I mean, that hurts. Imagine if it's your teeth growing into your neck. So they are compelled to gnaw, to always be chiseling down those teeth. And maybe this beaver just needed a big project, but I was just out hiking along Hiroshi, and I noticed that they seem to be beginning to choose food sources that aren't preferable. When you see them feeding particularly on evergreens, it's really a sign of a beaver in dire straits. So I would expect beavers to be looking for a new place to go soon. And then they'll come back because those trees will regenerate.
So Susie, will the individuals move on, or do they just sort of die off and then it gets recolonized?
No, they'll move on. I mean, if they run out of a food preference, they'll move on as a, you know, male and a female kind of. Probably not right now because they're kind of in the middle of everything with the young, but eventually they'll have to move on. Do they gnaw down trees for food or to build dams? Both. Beavers are using the trees as a food source. They're eating the inner bark, not the yellow bark that we're seeing, but kind of that inner cambium layer. The inner bark is their food. And then they also use it for building, and they're going to build their lodge with it and their dam with it. So really kind of finding a lot of purpose in their food source as a building source too. Pretty neat. Big fan of the beavers. I don't think I could build, their lodges are incredible. They have a underwater entrance, and there's sort of they come in and there's like a mud room where they can dry off and shake. And then the mudroom kind of slopes up to a sleeping loft area, which is lined with grasses. And I mean, that's quite architecture to build something that's thought out like that. I don't think that I could construct something like that on my own, especially with my teeth. So, all right, do we have anything more?
Yeah, I want to correct something I said earlier, Susie. The woodpecker's tongue does, my memory was faulty, it curls up around the back of the brain. As you alluded to, it's connected to the brain, and I thought it was the front. It's actually around the back.
Still, what do you think it tastes like? It's like one of those questions. How long does it take a beaver? These are the ponderables we'll leave you with tonight. Okay, let's check and see.
I can tell you how long it takes for a beaver to take down a dozen white birch, and that's one night.
Well said, Linda. I mean, there's that great story about in Peterborough down by the Depot Park where they planted these expensive willow trees, and they planted them, and they all went home, and they came back the next day and they were just gone. The beavers were like, yes, somebody planted willow. We love willow. So it is true. It's kind of a funny thing. Well, you know, if you're eating bark, I guess you can be choosy. Oh, so I think we're at the end of our evening here tonight. I just want to say that we're going to be doing another one on May 28th. Please send us any more natural history mysteries that you find. Amphibians and reptiles could be more represented. That would be so exciting. And it looks like we're going to be sending the flower question out to some of another expert. So that'll be really good. We can report back on it at our next time. So thank you, everybody. Thank you especially to all of you who came out to hear this, and all the experts that showed up to respond, and Miles for sending out the Zoom information. And oh, it's so nice to spend our time like this and get connected, even though we all have to be on a screen, just to know that there's other people out there that love nature as much as we do. So keep on hiking, keep on looking, and we'll be here in 2 weeks to talk with you all again. So thank you.
Seriously.
Yay.